From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Right now, the next couple of weeks are going to be critical in our ability to address those surgings that we're seeing in Florida, in Texas, in Arizona, and in other states.
As COVID-19 cases soar in the United States to a new single-day high, we look at how the pandemic is devastating the hemisphere's two largest countries, the United States and Brazil.
In South America this weekend, Brazil surpassed 1 million COVID-19 cases, joining the United States as the only other country in the world with cases in the 6 digits.
We'll speak with Marcia Castro, chair of the Department of Global Health and Population at Harvard School of Public Health. Then to the Reverend William Barber, co-founder of the Poor People's Campaign.
In recent weeks, we've heard the media ask, when will the protests stop? Since we've launched this campaign, people have asked, what one demand is your top priority? Well, we say, when you decided to do COVID response, you gave $2.5 trillion, nearly $3 trillion to the banks and the corporations. If they can have 3 trillion things, don't ask us what is our one thing.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United States reported nearly 37,000 coronavirus cases nationwide Wednesday, the highest daily toll yet, as much of the U.S. South and West barrel toward a new and deadlier phase of the pandemic. Florida, Oklahoma, South Carolina, and Texas all confirm record numbers of new COVID-19 cases, with infections increasing in 29 states. In Houston, the Texas Medical Center reports 97% of its intensive care unit beds are full. Officials are planning to convert standard hospital beds into ICUs, many of them staffed by medical workers who don't have experience treating critical care patients. California hit a record high of over 7,000 new cases Tuesday, as Governor Gavin Newsom warned residents to follow mandatory mask use and social distancing requirements or face a new round of lockdowns. Disneyland in Southern California said it's abandoned plans to reopen the theme park July 17th, while organizers of the New York City Marathon have canceled plans for November's race. Meanwhile, the governors of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut issued a travel advisory warning people arriving from states with high rates of coronavirus to quarantine for 14 days or face heavy fines. In March, New York Governor Cuomo threatened to sue Rhode Island what it opposed similar limits on New Yorkers. In Geneva, Switzerland, the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, warned Wednesday the pandemic will soon reach a grim milestone of 10 million confirmed coronavirus cases.
The epidemic in the Americas in general is still intense. It's particularly intense in Central and South America, and it's across a range of countries. And we've seen a steady and worrying continuation of trend, with many countries experiencing between 25 and 50% rise in cases over the last week, which means many countries in Central and South America and in the Americas in general are still suffering sustained community transmission.
That's the World Health Organization's Dr. Michael Ryan. Brazil remains the hardest-hit nation in Latin America, with an official death toll of nearly 54,000. India continues to report record coronavirus cases almost daily, and hospitals in New Delhi, the epicenter of India's outbreak, are bracing for 500,000 COVID-19 cases by late July. Back in the United States, dozens of Secret Service agents who worked security at President Trump's campaign rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma last weekend have been ordered to self-isolate after 2 of their colleagues tested positive for COVID-19. This comes as Tulsa County recorded 259 new coronavirus cases Wednesday, a record daily toll. Meanwhile, White House counselor Kellyanne Conway Wednesday defended President Trump's use of the racist term Kung Flu to describe COVID-19 at rallies in Tulsa and Phoenix this week.
My reaction is that the president has made very clear he wants everybody to understand, and I think many Americans do understand, that the virus originated in China, and had China been more transparent and honest with the United States and the world, we wouldn't have all the death and destruction that, unfortunately, we've suffered.
Kellyanne Conway's statement contrasts sharply with her remarks 3 months ago when she called the term Kung Flu highly offensive and attacked Asian-American reporter Wei Jiazheng for not naming a White House official who reportedly used the slur.
And that's highly offensive, so you should tell us all who it is. I'd like to know who it is. I'm not going to engage in hypotheticals. I'm married to an Asian. I mean, I'm not engaging in hypotheticals. My kids are.
1 month after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police officers, protests in support of Black lives and against police brutality continue across the United States. Here in New York, activists have set up a 24-hour protest encampment outside City Hall, demanding $1 billion in cuts to the city's $6 billion police budget, with the money reinvested in health care, housing, and social services. In Seattle, Washington, protesters have largely ended their occupation of a 6-block so-called autonomous zone known as the Capitol Hill Occupied Protest, or CHOP. In a statement, protest leaders wrote, quote, "We successfully built a self-governing community and convinced city leaders to enact meaningful police reform, including substantial budget cuts to the Seattle Police Department." In Oakland, California, the school board voted unanimously Wednesday to eliminate its police force. Meanwhile, Chicago's school board voted 4-3 to keep police in public schools. On Capitol Hill, Senate Democrats blocked debate on a Republican police reform bill Wednesday, saying the legislation failed to limit the use of no-knock warrants while allowing federal law enforcement officers to continue using chokeholds. The statement means it's unlikely Congress will pass any new measures limiting police use of force until after November's election. A warning to our audience. The following stories contain graphic images of police violence. Calls are growing for the city of Aurora, Colorado, to conduct a new investigation into the death last year of Elijah McClain. He was a 23-year-old African-American massage therapist who died after being tackled by police and placed in a chokehold and then being injected with ketamine by paramedics. McClain was stopped by 3 police officers on August 24, 2019, as he was walking home from picking up an iced tea for his brother at a convenience store. Police claimed he was acting suspicious. He died August 30th after days on life support in the hospital. On Wednesday, Colorado Governor Jared Polis announced the state would review the case. In New York City, police officers responding to a 911 call used tasers to electrocute a Queens man to death inside his own home late Sunday after a neighbor falsely reported he had a gun. Another neighbor said the 29-year-old George Zabantis, who had a history of mental illness, had been playing with a sword dressed as a gladiator in his own basement when police arrived on the scene. A lawyer for the family disputed a police account that Zabantis threatened officers and has demanded the NYPD turn over body cam footage. Meanwhile, a New York police officer who was filmed using a banned chokehold on an African-American man last Sunday will face second-degree strangulation charges. Officer David Afanador previously faced criminal charges after he repeatedly pistol-whipped a 16-year-old boy during a marijuana bust, sending the boy to the hospital with 2 broken teeth. The police chief in Tucson, Arizona, has offered to resign following the death of a man in police custody. 27-year-old Carlos Ingram Lopez died April 21st after police tasered him at his grandmother's house. His family had called the police because the man was drunk and running around the house naked. When police arrived, they wrestled the man to the ground and handcuffed him with his hands behind his back. They then tasered him, ordering him to calm down and relax. In police body cam video, Carlos Ingram Lopez can be heard asking for water and his grandmother. At one point, he says, "I can't breathe." The Pima County Attorney's Office is now conducting a criminal investigation of the actions of the officers who have all resigned. in Wisconsin. A 19-year-old black woman facing life in prison on charges of killing her alleged sex trafficker was freed from jail on bail Monday. Crystal Kaiser had been imprisoned for 2 years while awaiting trial. She was allegedly trafficked beginning at the age of 16 by Randall Volar, a 34-year-old white man. Court records reportedly show Volar had a history of sexually abusing underage black girls but remained free. Kaiser says she shot and killed Volar in self-defense in 2018 after he drugged her and tried to rape her. Advocates have pointed to the striking similarities between Kaiser's case and that of Centoya Brown's, who was freed from prison last year after being granted clemency while serving a life sentence for killing a man who bought her for sex when she was just 16 years old. In Georgia, a grand jury has indicted 3 white men on murder charges for killing Ahmaud Arbery, the 25-year-old black man who was chased down and shot to death February 23rd. Retired police officer Greg McMichael and his son Travis, along with their friend William Bryan, walked free for months after Arbery's killing and were only arrested after a video of the killing, filmed by Bryant, went viral on social media. The 3 men remain in Glynn County Jail and have not yet been arraigned. Also in Georgia, a Republican-controlled committee of state lawmakers has advanced a bill that would bar election officials from mailing absentee ballot applications to millions of active registered voters ahead of November's election. Under Senate Bill 463, voters who want to cast ballots by mail would have to initiate the process themselves. Rhode Island's governor has signed an executive order to shorten the state's name on official documents from the state of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations to just the state of Rhode Island. State Senator Harold Metz, who's African-American, said he'll also push to officially change the state's name as well. Metz said, quote, "The word plantations conjures extremely painful images for many Rhode Islanders." In Wisconsin, Democratic State Senator Tim Carpenter was hospitalized after he was assaulted on Tuesday during a chaotic night in Madison. Carpenter said he was punched multiple times and kicked in the head after he took a brief video of protesters on his phone. On the same night, a group of people took down 2 statues in Madison. One for the Abolitionist Union Army Colonel Hans Christian Hegg, and another known as Forward statue that has come to represent women's rights. Several historians questioned why these statues were targeted, but one activist said the prominent display of those statues create a, quote, false representation of what this city is, unquote. Israel's facing increasing international condemnation over its plan to annex parts of the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called on Israel to abandon its plan.
If implemented, annexation would constitute the most serious violation of international law, grievously harm the prospect of a 2-state solution, and undercut the possibilities of a renewal of negotiations. I call on the Israeli government to abandon its annexation plans.
Meanwhile, 7 European nations have issued a joint statement saying annexation would violate international law and weaken efforts to advance regional peace. Belgium, Britain, Estonia, France, Germany, Ireland, and Norway signed the statement. Back in the United States, a hospital in Philadelphia has put off plans to deport an undocumented Guatemalan man back to his home country after facing protests from medical students and immigrant rights activists. The Guatemalan man has been treated at the Jefferson Torresdale Hospital since suffering a serious head injury in May during a motorcycle accident. The man's family fear he would die if transferred back to Guatemala. The case is bringing renewed attention to what's known as medical repatriations, where a hospital arranges to privately deport individuals who cannot pay for medical treatment. In a major win for progressive Democrats, Jamal Bowman has claimed victory in Tuesday's primary election over 16-term New York Congressmember Eliot Engel, the powerful chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Bowman tweeted, quote, "I'm a black man raised by a single mother in a housing project. That story doesn't usually end in Congress, but today that 11-year-old boy beaten by police is about to be your representative. I can't wait to get to D.C. and cause problems for those maintaining the status quo," he said. While Bowman leads by over 25 percentage points, many absentee ballots have not yet been counted. The Democratic National Committee has announced plans to hold its national convention almost entirely online to slow community spread of the coronavirus. Joe Biden's expected to accept the Democratic Party's presidential nomination at an in-person event in Milwaukee August 20th, but delegates are being asked not to travel to Wisconsin for the convention as initially planned, but hold a convention across America. A federal appeals court has ordered a lower court to dismiss the criminal case against Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, even though Flynn twice pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his communications with the Russian ambassador. The ruling's a major victory for the Justice Department, which has sought to drop the case against Flynn. The ruling came as the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the politicization of the Justice Department. Former Deputy Attorney General Donald Ayer, who served under George H.W. Bush, said William Barr poses, quote, the greatest threat in my lifetime to our rule of law.
I think we're on the way to something far worse than Watergate, where you had a problem of public distrust, because it's becoming very transparent that many things are being done, essentially for reasons that are completely unrelated to the merits of the case.
The pharmaceutical giant Bayer, which acquired Monsanto 2 years ago, has agreed to pay $10 billion to settle tens of thousands of claims that the popular weed killer Roundup causes cancer. The deal has been described as among the largest settlements ever in U.S. civil litigation. In the Caribbean, a massive dust plume from the Sahara Desert has darkened skies and forced residents with respiratory illness to shelter indoors. Models show haze will soon settle over much of the United States, bringing hazardous air quality to states as far north as Michigan. Saharan dust storms are common, but meteorologists say this one is unprecedented in at least a half a century. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison has filed suit against ExxonMobil, Koch Industries, and the American Petroleum Institute, accusing the fossil fuel companies of defrauding consumers by covering up the effects of climate change. Minnesota joins at least 15 other plaintiffs, including attorneys general in Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island, who've brought similar lawsuits. Ellison was joined at a news conference Wednesday by Juwaria Jama, a 16-year-old leader with the Minnesota Youth Climate Strike.
These corporations knew the impacts of climate change long before. They could have sounded the alarm and began working towards solutions. Instead, they decided to deceive the public. They knew exactly what was happening, and instead of making choices to repair our planet, they covered up the damage. Instead of allowing experts to craft solutions, they hid the problem. I'm here today because these corporations have gone far too long without ever being held accountable for the damages they have caused to our globe and our future.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. When we come back, we look at how the pandemic is devastating the Western Hemisphere's two largest countries, the United States and Brazil. Stay with us.
We all need somebody to lean on. Well, just might have a problem. Do you understand? We all need somebody to lean on. Lean on me. When you're not strong, I'll be a friend. I'll help you carry on. Oh, it won't be long till I'm gonna need somebody to lean on. You just call me, brother, when you need a hand. We all need somebody to lean on. I just might have a problem. Do you understand? We all need somebody.
Kenny Sway performing Bill Withers' Lean on Me, a remarkable scene with thousands of peaceful protesters waving their cell phone flashlights in front of the White House earlier this month. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman here in New York with Nermeen Sheikh, broadcasting from her home. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, as COVID-19 cases soar in the United States to a new single-day high, we look at how the pandemic is devastating the hemisphere's two largest countries, the United States and Brazil. We'll start south in Brazil. As the number of confirmed coronavirus infections worldwide approaches 10 million, nearly half of all of them can be found in the Americas, in part because of an explosion of cases in Brazil, which now has the worst infection rate in the world. Some epidemiologists say the death toll of the pandemic in Brazil could pass the United States by next month. This comes as a judge has ordered Brazil's far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, to wear a mask in public, or he'll face a fine of nearly $400 per violation. Bolsonaro continues to attend massive political rallies across Brazil. During a virtual briefing Wednesday, the World Health Organization's Marcos Espinal said Brazil is not doing enough testing.
Brasil es un país que tiene muchos recursos.
Brazil is a country that has many resources that could increase the number of tests it's conducting. Over the past few weeks, Brazil has made progress in increasing its testing for COVID. But Brazil still doesn't arrive at 10,000 tests for each million residents, and it's necessary that they do more.
Meanwhile, Brazil is joining other countries in testing an experimental coronavirus vaccine created by Oxford University. But the country's health minister says the government has yet to strike a deal to get the vaccine if it works. Well, for more, we're joined by Marcia Castro. She's professor of demography and chair of the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She also co-chairs the Brazil Studies program at Harvard Center for Latin American Studies. Professor Castro, we welcome you to Democracy Now! Why don't you start off by talking about the scope of the problem in Brazil, approaching only the United States, which is #1 in the world when it comes to these coronavirus cases of infection and deaths. We'll talk about the U.S. in a minute, but talk about what's happening in your country, in Brazil.
Good morning, Amy. So I just want to start by saying that the frustrating thing about this story is that Brazil could be teaching a lesson to the entire world on how to respond to a pandemic by leveraging its history, its network of primary care, which is one of the largest in the world, and by using its universal healthcare system. And yet, what we see in the country is a reflection of the leadership that we have. So a leadership that has and continues to downplay the importance of the virus, that neglects science, and that's an important point as well, and that creates a situation that mayors and governors who want to give the right response to implement actions, they face this situation that they are doing something that goes against what the president says. So it makes it hard for the population to adhere to what they are trying to do. And it also is a failure because we could have our community health agents, and we have almost 300,000 of those being the backbone of the response. And yet, the primary care and the community health agents are not being used as part of the response. So Brazil is not testing enough, as you said. Well, we're not doing contact tracing either. So the community health agents could be doing the contact tracing. They could be identifying the elderly, the people that are more vulnerable. They could identify those people that don't have water at home. That's the other thing. So Brazil is a country with lots of inequalities. We cannot expect that you're just going to take whatever countries in Europe or high-income countries have done and implement in Brazil and it's going to work. It really has to be adapted to those inequalities of informal labor, people that can't stop working, people that live in very high density households, so there's no way they can do self-isolation, and people that don't have access to water. And we keep going with inequalities, the number of hospital beds and physicians per population. Those numbers are worse in the states in the Amazon region. It's not by chance that we see the regional pattern of deaths and cases in Brazil that we are observing. And it's a shame that they could be very different if we actually use what we have. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but just use the network of healthcare resources the country has, and we're neglecting to do this.
Professor Castro, you've mentioned, you just talked about these community health centers and how they could be used for this, to combat this pandemic. But I'd like to ask about, first of all, the region that's been the worst affected by the pandemic in Brazil, namely the Amazon, and whether such community health centers exist in the region. I mean, the situation is so bad. We spoke to world-renowned Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado last month, and he said that the indigenous population of the Amazon are effectively facing a genocide if the government doesn't intervene. They're so vulnerable and have died in such large numbers. So could you talk about access to health services in the Amazon, why the region has been disproportionately affected, and also the accelerated rate of deforestation that's presently occurring, and how that's impacting the spread of the virus?
Yeah, that's a very important point, Amy. So what we have is the region already has the worst indicators in terms of health services. So it is the place in Brazil where you have the lowest numbers of hospital beds per person, physicians per person. Many municipalities don't have hospitals and ICU beds, then it's even worse. So you already start the pandemic having fewer resources in those places. In addition, we have several communities in the region that have the other inequalities that I mentioned. Overall, in the Amazon region, 43% of the population don't have access to water, but in some states it's even higher than that. Then there is a completely separate health care for the indigenous populations. And those have lost a lot of the physicians in the past few years when a large program that existed in Brazil that brought foreigner physicians to work in those underserved areas was completely dismantled. So again, you keep adding those layers, right? So since this new president took term, there is not a lot of attention in terms of preserving the environment. In fact, last year we saw rampant deforestation, a horrible fire season, and this year we already overpassed the deforestation from last year, and we still have about a month and a half to go of the cutting season. So whenever you have this deforestation, you have contacts of those people that want to exploit the land with indigenous areas. We see that it's exactly in the indigenous reserves where we are seeing most of the damage. And those areas are supposed to be preserved, and then they used to be. So you have indigenous people dying because of this encounter, but on top of this, now they are being infected because the people that come into the area may bring the virus as well. So they can bring any pathogen. And it's not just deforestation. We have to remember there's also mining, which is another activity that exposed the indigenous people to that. So overall, Brazil, we have 110 indigenous areas that have been affected with COVID. We have about 7,200 indigenous people that have been infected, and the number keeps rising, and about 330 deaths that already have been reported. Now, what happens also is that because a lot of municipalities don't have hospitals, don't have beds, the health system work with a sort of regionalization scheme. So whenever people need hospital care, need to be hospitalized, there is a reference municipality that takes all those people. What we saw in Manaus, which was the first capital in the Amazon region that really had a completely overloaded of the health system, is that once the capital is completely overloaded and they cannot even provide hospitalizations for people living in the capital, they can't serve all the municipalities that depend on them. So the very high number of deaths that we observed in those areas, part of them could have been avoided if we had enough hospital services available. But above all, they could have been avoided if we provided a better response. So the community health agents, they are all over Brazil. They basically act on the community. They know the people they serve, and each team has about one physician, one nurse, and around 6 community health workers. They go to house by house to provide care, and they have very good coverage in the poor and vulnerable areas, so in the north and northeast. But again, once the pandemic started, those community health agents were not provided with protective equipment, so they can't go on the street. And they were not provided with training either. So those people that could be right there on the ground, helping to identify symptoms, helping to isolate people, and therefore helping to do contact tracing, and therefore helping to flatten the curve so we could have avoided this overload in the hospital system, they were not working. So it's not just about the inequalities. They do play a role. It's not just about the low provision of health services in the area. They also play a role, but it's about the completely chaotic response that basically exacerbated all those inequalities, all of them combined, and created the situation we saw in Manaus, then we saw in Belém, and right now, Porto Velho, another capital in the Amazon, it has more than 90% occupancy of hospital beds. So we can start hearing from this capital pretty soon. Now, I also want to make a point that the fire season is about to start in about a month or so. And if we had this high level of deforestation, the fires will come, because that's usually the process. The wood now is on the floor. Whatever they couldn't sell, they're going to burn. And whenever we have the fire season, we have an increase in respiratory conditions. We have an increase in the demand for hospitalizations because of respiratory conditions. And we have an increase in the mortality of children under the age of 10. Now, this is it's a horrible combination. An increase in respiratory conditions may make people more susceptible to a severe COVID-19 infection. So we can have an overlay of 2 huge problems that will create again another collapse in the hospital system. So we've been trying to raise awareness of this and try to avoid a fire season like we had last year, because this would be devastating, and the effects wouldn't stay just in the Amazon. What happens in the Amazon does not stay in the Amazon. And as we saw last year, the smoke and therefore all the particulates that comes from the forest fires, they can travel and they can go to other areas and therefore affect other people in Brazil as well.
Professor Castro, earlier this month, the iconic Amazon indigenous Kayapo chief, Palinho Paiacon, died of COVID-19. He was 66 years old. He was a lifelong defender of the Amazon rainforest who, in the 1980s, led the resistance against the Belo Monte hydroelectric project, an environmentally destructive, massive complex of dams planned to be built on the Xingu River in the heart of the Amazon. The project successfully suspended at the time, but later reinstated. In recent years, Paiacon had warned against Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro's calls to open the Amazon for agriculture and mining, which brings us back to the president and his policies, and now the fact that he's being fined by a judge for himself not protecting himself, very similar to his ally, President Trump. But his policies in the Amazon and what they're doing now, Professor Castro.
Well, it's unfortunate because when you see what's being done in the Amazon now, we're basically losing about 20 years of achievements of really being able to make protected reserve forests, protected indigenous areas. We had a forest code that was really a model. We were able to reduce deforestation to the lowest levels and maintain them there. And we're losing this. We're losing this at rampant rates. that's bringing a lot of deaths. A lot of the deaths of local leaders, indigenous peoples, or people that are just trying to protect the forest are not even advertised. So the situation is very complicated because those are big business people. They are making money by clearing the forest, and the local producers, the local communities, it's very hard for them to fight against those people, especially when they're backed up by the government. Recently, the government basically pardoned fines that people had to pay because of deforestation. That sends a bad message. So if you're not going to be penalized, if you're not going to be held accountable, let's go ahead and do more. So what we are seeing in the environmental agenda in Brazil is very concerning. Recently, there have been different groups that wrote letters to international people that basically import related to the agribusiness in Brazil, import products from Brazil. And now I hope this is going to create some discussion at the federal level, because if there's one thing they don't want to damage is the agribusiness in Brazil. And if the big importers decide to stop buying the products because they are causing a lot of deforestation or a lot of changes in the balance, in the environmental balance in the Amazon, then that could create a reaction. But if nothing happens, if they just can profit in ways that are really not understandable, because we have enough data to show that during the years when deforestation is going down, the Amazon was extremely productive. The agribusiness was extremely productive. So we can make the Amazon to be productive and profitable without having to remove more forest cover. But again, they're big fish, and it's hard for local communities to fight against them.
Well, Professor Castro, you mentioned earlier that Brazil has, of course, less resources to be able to do the kinds of things, to take the measures that countries in Europe have taken, like social distancing and quarantines and wearing masks and so on. And now, of course, COVID is spreading at an accelerated rate in developing countries, in the poorer countries of Latin America, South Asia, and Africa, where there is also a massive shortage of medical equipment, including the most urgent for fighting COVID, namely oxygen. And in one country in Latin America, and perhaps not the only one, in Peru, now oxygen is being sold on the black market for up to 1,000% markup. Meanwhile, Yemen, which was already the poorest country in the world before 2015, the Saudi-led coalition bombing of the country, COVID is also spreading there. And unlike most of the world, 25% of the people who contract COVID-19 in Yemen die. That's 5 times more than the global average. So if you could talk a little bit about, you've been working, attending a conference that looks at the development of a vaccine for COVID-19 and how to ensure access to the vaccine in the countries that have been most vulnerable to its spread, including Brazil. So could you tell us where that stands now?
Yes, that's a very good question. So Brazil now is going to test 2 vaccines. So there is an agreement that was signed with the Chinese pharmaceutical company and with the vaccine from Oxford. And then there are also groups in Brazil developing different types of vaccines. So there's a different effort in different fronts. Now, the key issue for low and middle income countries will be if we imagine a scenario, hypothetical scenario, that we get a good vaccine, whatever good means, that's a different discussion, and it's ready to be produced at scale, and then for a vaccination at scale. So the first item, production at scale, right? So if the production is going to be restricted to the high-income countries, it does raise the question, who is going to get it first? And we saw this before. when we had the H1N1 that the rich countries got the vaccine first because they could pay for it or they were producing it, and then the others had to wait. That is the first discussion. That's why it's so important for those agreements, international agreements that are being made, so that countries can have access to all the science behind the vaccine development, but they also can have access to the vaccine being produced. Brazil is unique in the sense that they do have at least two public institutions, and I'll go back to this point in a moment, but they have Butantan Institute and they have a Fiocruz that they already produce most of the vaccines distributed in the country. They can do it. However, it depends what type of coronavirus vaccine we're going to have. There are different types of them, and each one of them demands a different type of industrial plant to be able to produce. So again, what countries should be doing now, and there are some European countries doing this, is the ones that have the industrial capacity to produce the vaccine, they should be trying to find ways to expedite the industrial production, so the moment something is ready, they can do it. Again, not every country will be able to do this, and they will depend on the countries producing the vaccine to have access to it. The second thing is it depends on how the vaccine will be distributed. Is it a type of vaccine that is very stable and easy to carry? Is it a type of vaccine that is not very stable and it's going to be much more tricky to go around the country and to the very isolated areas to distribute? We don't know that yet. But that can bring challenges to the whole logistic process of doing vaccination at scale. The other thing is we don't know how many doses we're going to need, and we don't know how countries inside each country, they will prioritize who is going to get first. Now, again, the case of Brazil is interesting because we do have a universal health system. Everybody gets access to care and to vaccination for free. You don't pay a penny for it. So in theory, every person in Brazil will be eligible to receive this vaccine once it's available. But if it takes a long period of time to produce the vaccines, right? We have 8 billion people in the world. So how long is it going to take to produce 8 billion doses? Well, if you can only produce 1 billion per year, you can imagine that we're going to have to set priorities both on inside each country who is going to get first and how countries will make agreements on how many doses they're going to receive. So the vaccination at scale is going to be extremely complicated. And I think that with the support from Gavi, from WHO, we have to find ways to make this as equitable as possible so we don't see another situation where the most vulnerable takes the heavier burden in the vaccination.
Professor Castro, we only have a minute, and I want to ask you about this massive spike of coronavirus infections in the United States. In the most populous states, in Texas, California, and Florida, which make up a quarter of the U.S. population, they're seeing the largest spike in the history of this pandemic. This comes as the White House now says it will no longer fund federal testing sites. And you have President Trump refusing to wear a mask in public. You have dozens of Secret Service agents who are with him in Tulsa, now in self-isolation. That's just one example, a spike in Tulsa where he was. Very quickly, if you can say what you think needs to happen in this country.
Well, honestly, what we need is better leadership, because if we keep putting people through rallies in a closed environment where people don't wear masks, if we keep sending the message that that's no big deal while people are dying and dying a lot, then, I can't think of any way to solve the problem of the only two countries that have done more than 1 million cases other than having better leadership, a leadership that can trust in science.
Well, Professor Marcia Castro, we want to thank you for being with us, Professor of Demography and Chair of the Department of Global Health and Population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Also co-chairs the Brazil Studies Program at Harvard Center for Latin American Studies. When we come back, the Reverend William Barber, co-founder of the Poor People's Campaign. Stay with us. on just a little while longer. The virtual choir during the mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington on Saturday, organized by our next guest, Reverend William Barber. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Hours before President Trump spoke Saturday at his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Poor People's Campaign offered a counterpoint with a mass digital gathering where the campaign unveiled a policy platform to spur transformative action. In a minute, we'll be joined by one of the key organizers, Reverend Dr. Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, president of Repairers of the Breach. But first, we turn to a part of his speech on Saturday, watched by millions.
In recent weeks, we've heard the media ask, when will the protests stop? Since we've launched this campaign, people have asked, what one demand is your top priority? Well, we say, when you decided to do COVID response, you gave $2.5 trillion, nearly $3 trillion to the banks and the corporation. If they can have 3 trillion things, don't ask us what is our one thing.
That's Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. We welcome you to Democracy Now! You were speaking there on Saturday. He's joining us now from Raleigh, North Carolina, where COVID-19 cases are surging. Governor Roy Cooper has issued an executive order for people across North Carolina to wear masks or other face coverings in public to fight the spread of COVID-19. And President Trump has moved the Republican convention from North Carolina to Florida because he didn't want any limitations or requirements that masks be worn at the convention or that there be social distancing. Reverend Barber, welcome back to Democracy Now! If you can start off by talking about where you go from here. What was this mass march on Washington, virtually, that you held, and what you're demanding now?
Well, thank you so much, Amy. And you opened with that song that was written and designed by Miss Yara Allen, one of our theomusicologists, and it really tells the story. For more than 3 years, we've been moving across this country, organizing the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. We now have 45 coordinating committees, more than 200 partners. We have more than 19 religious denominations and various groups that are part of this effort, and many others. And what happened on Saturday, we had planned to be in D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, but because of COVID-19, we couldn't. But our people said, we have to still do this. And so we did. And when you heard me, for instance, speaking there, that was after 50 people, at least 50 people, impacted people from across this country, poor and low wealth, had told their stories and made their demands. More than 2.5 million people turned out for the mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington, a digital affair, 2.5 million just on Facebook. Now, that doesn't include what happened on other networks and C-SPAN and radios across this land. What it was people, poor and low wealth people, counterintuitively, coal miners from Kentucky, with poor folk from Alabama, white women from West Virginia standing with black women from Mississippi, and so forth and so on. Farmers from Kansas standing with fast food workers from North Carolina, saying that there are 5 issues that we have to address. Systemic racism in all of its form, black people, how it affects black people, brown people, First Nation people, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And we must do it out of our deepest moral traditions, constitutionally, religiously. We must do it with deep love, but also with deep truth. And they decided, we want to tell our story. We want to show America herself. We want to put a face on these issues, and then we want to put the facts around these issues, and then we want to put forward an agenda. And so that's what we did on Saturday, and it was overwhelmingly beyond our expectations received. One of the things our agenda says to people is, do you realize that when voter suppression is put in place, that it suppresses the vote, targets at the black vote, but what it does, it also allows people to get elected who then block health care and block living wages. And that hurts all of us, regardless of your race, your creed, your color. Our agenda also says, do you realize that we took 1 million, we took one military contract we could fund every state that has refused to accept the Affordable Care Act. The insurance there. Just one military contract could give preschool to all the children we need. If we just took the money that we spent since 9/11, we could have had a green grid for our country to deal with new kinds of energy. Do you realize that if we spent $15, we raised the living wage to $15, 40 million people could come out of poverty and low wealth. If we had a housing wage, 83 million people could come out of poverty and low wealth. That's the focus of this agenda, to say the choices we are making are bad choices. That's why we have 140 million people poor and low wealth in this country, and 62 million people who work every day without a living wage, and 80 million people without insurance or underinsured. And it doesn't have to be this way.
Well, Reverend Barbara, I want to ask, you've just said that there were 5 demands which you've listed of things that need to happen. I'd like to turn to a lengthy piece for the New York Times Magazine headlined, "What is Owed?" by reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones, who lays out the case for reparations, saying most notably that it is wealth and not income that is a means to security in America. But wealth is not something people create solely by themselves. It's accumulated across generations. She goes on to say that American history has systematically robbed African Americans of this possibility, and that the racial wealth gap is about the same today as it was in the 1950s. She says that reparations are the only means through which to compensate for the structures of inequality that have made it all but impossible for African Americans to achieve anything like the financial security that white Americans take for granted. She cites a Yale University study which found that, in fact, most Americans have absolutely no idea of the extraordinary scale of this racial inequality. The report finds that Americans are under the impression that Black households hold $90 in wealth for every $100 held by white households. But the truth is that Black households have only $10 for every $100 in white households. So could you respond to that, and whether you support the idea that there should be reparations?
Well, what our dear sister is saying to us is that we have to deal with the reality of this country and how much inequality was sown into the very foundations, economic foundations, social foundations of this country. Yes, we need to deal with the issue of reparations. And yes, she's exactly right that it's about wealth and income in some degree. But what that says to me is that's why we can't just talk about people having a job. Because just having a job, if it's a low-wage job, it does not allow you to deal with wealth. It does not allow you to accumulate wealth. She's also right that you cannot fix these inequalities, say, by just having Black businesses in the community or just by saying people pull themselves up by their own bootstrap. It was policies, government policies, intentional policies that created disenfranchisement, that stole wealth, that built this country on the backs of people without them having to pay anything. You think about it, 250 years of free labor. It's no wonder that America has a greater gross domestic product and is the wealthiest nation in the country. 250 years of free labor, and on top of that, 100 years of segregation. And now we still pay people less than a living, we pay people $7.25 for African Americans. That means it's taken us 400 years to get to $7.25 an hour if you work a minimum wage job, because we started out at 0 in slavery. Well, you can't wait another 400 years. What we do in the Poor People's Campaign, though, is we also want to show that if you're going to talk about reparations, you got to talk about it for our First Nation brothers and sisters. You cannot leave them out. You cannot leave those people out who were the victims of genocide as well, even before slavery. And you have to show how all of these systems have undermined so much possibility for people. That's why we deal with people in Appalachia, poor folk in Appalachia. And so we point out that while there are 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country, 66 million of them are white. 26 million are black. Now, the 26 million black are 61% of all African Americans. Our campaign, it says, we cannot deal with these issues separately. So just like we fight for reparations for African Americans, we also have to fight for the same thing for First Nation people, our Native American brothers and sisters. And we also have to show everybody else that racism is targeted at black people and people of color, but it ends up undermining this democracy. And one of the things we pointed out on Saturday is that every regressive policy has what I call a DM on the DL. That is a death measurement on the down low. When we talk about, for instance, the death of George Floyd, which we have to in police violence, but police violence is only one part of racism that kills and classism that kills. For every 500,000 people that are denied health care, 2,800 people die. For 700 people die every day from poverty, even before COVID. And we know we're headed toward poverty going probably plus 50% in this economic downturn. Every regressive policy has a death measurement on the down low, and we've got to bring those things out. We even have to show people that racist voter suppression has a death measurement, because when people are allowed to get elected through racist voter suppression, and then once they get elected, they block health care, they block living wages, they block reparations. They, in fact, are blocking policies that could cause people to live. And in blocking them, people die. The first declaration this country made, we never lived up to it fully, is the declaration to life. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, life. In far too much of our regressive policies, we have never dealt with the issue of life, because we've never dealt with how so many policies create death. Racism has always had death in it. Classism has death in it. And so, yes, we have to repair and revive. That has to be a part of if we're truly going to ever be the democracy we claim to be on paper.
You co-wrote, Reverend Barbara, a piece in The Appeal headlined "American Democracy Cannot Breathe." In it, you link anti-police, anti-racism protests to low-income work in America, writing, "It is no coincidence that George Floyd was black, nor that he was an unemployed restaurant worker." Let's end there. We just have 30 seconds. As we speak in this historic election year of 2020, at the moment, in the midst of this pandemic, Georgia trying to deny absentee ballots automatically going out. What do you think needs to happen by November?
Well, what has to happen is our lawyers have to get into courts immediately now this summer and fight for more opportunities to vote. We have to make sure we overwhelm the system by registration and participation. We also have to make sure our people know about mail-in ballots and early voting. We have to fight for all those things. We're going to have protection, and we're going to have to keep doing what the protesters are doing, and we're doing, and that is breathing, refusing to allow anyone to suffocate this democracy. I think that's all what we're seeing in the streets is people are trying to breathe, justice is trying to breathe, truth is trying to breathe, and we have to make sure that at the ballot box there is all of us are there, and we vote and vote and vote until justice is revived.
We're going to have to leave it there. We thank you so much, Reverend Dr. William Barber, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Stay safe.